Thank you, Mary. I was really hoping that you would be able to tell us how to collect data on relationships and trust, and so I was let down on that, but maybe we'll get some answers from the audience. Is this thing gonna? Yeah, okay. All right, so my name is Matthew Plosser. I'm an economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Like every other researcher, I've spent a lot of time recently thinking about deposit stability. Maybe it's not something I thought about much before 2023, but now it seems to be what I spend most of my time thinking about. So I was really excited to read these three papers, all of which address different aspects of deposit stability. And my goal here is to just try to put all of these different concepts together in a framework that helps us think about why do we think deposit stability matters? Is there a way we can quantify this? And then what each of these papers brings to the table and what questions it sort of begs going forward. So I'm excited to get everybody's feedback on what they've presented. Just like every other Federal Reserve presenter, none of these views expressed are mine, sorry, they're all mine. They're all mine, and don't necessarily reflect the position of Michelle Bowman or the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And so, if there's anything wrong here, it's entirely on me. So just big picture, I wanted to lay out some of the features of deposits that I come up with when I'm thinking about deposit stability, because there's some different aspects of it that arrive when we go through each of these papers. I think the most prominent is price. So we know deposits are sort of this quasi-fixed rate liability. They move with interest rates, but not 100%. Some of them don't pay any interest at all. And so, there's some variation in that, and we typically call that, some notion of that, the deposit beta. What is the sensitivity of deposits to prevailing interest rates? A related idea is the quantity of deposits. So are deposits flowing in or deposits flowing out? This is a source of funding, and so you have both the price and the quantity side of it, and they're jointly determined. It's just like any other supply and demand curves, right? You can set a beta such that you keep your quantities stable, right? And so when we think about sensitivities, you kind of want to think about those two concepts together, because there's some beta which will keep your deposits flat, and there's some beta where they'll shrink, and there's some beta where they'll expand, and that just depends on the relative price you set for those things. The third component is related but somewhat independent, which is really about risk sensitivity, and I think it's a bit of the notion of what Rajesh was getting at with sophisticated depositors, but this idea that the sensitivity of depositors to the bank's health, not necessarily prevailing interest rates, but that particular bank. Am I worried I'm going to suffer a loss if I stay in this bank? And it's heavily influenced by whether or not the depositors are insured, right? Because if they're insured, they're much less sensitive to bank health. They know their deposits are protected. And so each of these components has sort of been addressed in each of these papers. Now, why do we care about any of these things? I think, besides just being the largest source of funding in the banking sector, on average, more than 50% of liabilities are going to be demand deposits. But instability in deposits, all the bankers know, threatens the solvency of the bank. And so from a price quantity standpoint, depositors' opportunity costs, the other rates in the economy, are going to determine whether or not what prices a bank feels it needs to pay, and paying higher prices lowers profits. We've seen a bunch of charts with NIMs and other net interest income margins, and of course, in the recent episode, there's certainly evidence that changing interest rates changes net interest income for banks. And on the other hand, if you don't raise interest rates, a shrinking stock of deposits might require you replace those deposits with some other instrument or source of funding that's going to be paying market rates. You're not going to enjoy that sort of fixed, that quasi-fixed nature of the deposit. Now, with respect to risk sensitivity, this is sort of what I would say is the exciting notion of deposits, which is the run or the flight. And so how sensitive is a bank's deposit funding to their own health, and will depositors leave if they're worried about it? And if depositors flee, banks can either replace the funds at market rates, if they're lucky, they could raise equity, or they could sell illiquid assets, which is really the worst case scenario. And if the value of the assets isn't high enough, these impaired assets may mean that you can't replace the funds at market rates, you can't raise equity, and 3 might not even be sufficient, and then now you have a solvency problem. And so we care about deposit stability because when deposits vary, it impacts the potential solvency of the bank and threatens the bank as an ongoing concern. And so I'm going to have very few equations, and hopefully it's all something that people are familiar with, but I'm going to propose a simple framework for thinking about how each of these factors enters into our notion of sort of the economic value of the bank. And so, standard accounting-based capital measures, they're going to be slow to recognize the impact of something like deposit stability, of higher prices on the value of the bank. You might start seeing it in earnings, but we already have some expectation of where this thing is going. What we really want to know is in expectation, what do we think the total value of the bank is? And an interest rate risk management tool to help evaluate that, the economic value of equity has been around for quite some time. And typically, when people calculate something like the economic value of equity, they're going to take the present value of their assets, they're going to subtract the present value of their liabilities, and then you're going to sensitize that value to changes in interest rates. And so it's a classic tool for thinking about interest rate risk exposure. But what I'm going to propose here is just, it also is going to tell us something about the value of these deposits when you're thinking about the economic capital of the bank. And so the key here is to get some market value or fair value of the assets and the liabilities, and then this is going to discount the horizon of profitability and tell you something about the current value of the bank, the current solvency of the bank. And so how does deposits enter into this? Well, I'm going to generate a really simple bank. They've got $1 in assets, they're 100% deposit funded, the deposits never mature, there's no other liabilities, but you can get this simple perpetuity equation, which is the value of those deposits, the present value of their liabilities, is primarily determined by the beta of the deposit and the interest rate. And so when we want to calculate something like EVE, you're going to get the present value of your assets minus just beta. And that's just a simple representation of what we think of as the value of those deposits. And so the higher your beta, the more you're paying in interest, the less valuable the bank is in sort of expectation. When beta is low, it means the present value of your liabilities is low, which is a good thing because that means you're going to have more economic value. When we think about higher prices, when betas go up, if you have to replace the deposit funding, if you're going to actually take out beta and now you're paying something like the prevailing interest rate or market rates, well, that's going to raise the present value of your liabilities and it's going to lower your economic capital. And last, if you're really in the scenario where you're selling assets, well, now you're going to be, you could have depressed asset values. They could be illiquid. You're selling them at a discount that you would rather not do. That's going to lower the present value of your assets, and that's going to lower the economic value. So there's all these different mechanisms in which the changing value of your deposits or the changing quantities of your deposits can end up changing the solvency of the bank, the economic value of the bank. And so through the lens of each of these papers, I want to think about sort of how those, the value of the bank changes. And the first, I'm going to look at the variable deposit betas and bank interest rate risk exposure paper. And this is the only regression table I'll put up here. But the key results I found in this paper, which is really just emphasizing that these betas aren't constant over time. If you go and look at like a standard handbook on how to calculate an economic value of equity, it's probably going to be like, well, you assume a beta of 0.4 or you assume a beta of 0.6, and you just keep it the same, and that's going to give you some value. But in reality, the betas are moving around. They vary with economic conditions. They vary with other types of monetary policy, quantitative tightening, quantitative easing, just due to the supply of safe assets, it's the supply of deposits in the market. And so, emphasizing that these deposit betas move is immediately telling you that there are risks moving around all the time, not just static risks of a deposit, but the cost of having a particular deposit is moving over time. And so that, that's just simply saying that when Fed funds rates are higher, the betas look to be higher. And this is sometimes referred to as deposit convexity, but it's an important thing to keep in mind when you're trying to assess whether or not a bank is profitable or insolvent in the long run. In the second paper, The Economics of Market-Based Deposit Insurance, I really enjoyed this chart because it really showed how this reaction to times of stress and what happened to insured deposits. And we can see that the banks that didn't have as easy a way of translating their deposits into insured deposits, they were more exposed to these stress events in Q1 2023, and their insured deposits grew slower, but in particularly their total deposits grew slower. And so this risk sensitivity was different across these banks. And it's just telling you something about how this could flow into actually the value of the bank. The more risk sensitive the bank is, the more deposits they lose in this episode, the more exposed they are from a risk sensitivity standpoint to their depositors, and it could impair the value of the bank. And then the third paper, which has this crazy cell phone data, which just doesn't seem legal, right? Like he's tracking people all over the place. You can't get away with this in Europe, I don't think. I'm just saying, like, it's anonymized, right? I know where they live, though. I also know where they bank. All right, I don't want to get you in trouble. I just, it's. But what's interesting about this paper is it focuses on a lot of features of depositors that we don't typically think about as researchers or supervisors or the bankers think about it. But the rest of us who are looking in from the outside don't think about it because we really don't ever get to see this. What is the nature of your deposit base? What are the types of customers that you have? We're lucky if we even know the breakdown between retail and non-retail. This is an instance where you're really learning a lot about the types of customers that they have. And there's much more granularity here. And this is just two of examples of it. Higher income depositors look to be receive higher interest expense, higher education is more sensitive to these deposit rates and demands higher interest expense. And I screwed up because I cut it off, and Rajesh, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the blue line is what it is for all the banks, or for the large banks, and the light blue line is what it is for the small banks, right? Right. And so it's actually really different across bank sizes. So these relationships don't even seem the same across bank sizes. I think you could probably strengthen this even more by looking at branch-specific rates. There's different data sources that can do that. None of them are cheap, but you could then be even more specific about which types of depositors look to be responding to different retail rates. But there's two things that stick out here. One is customer heterogeneity matters, but also the type of bank matters. And you're learning something on both dimensions. And each of these things end up impacting the value of the bank in the long run. Okay, so putting it all together, the deposit betas are variable. So what do we learn from that? That movements in deposit betas over time, they change the sensitivity of banks to interest rates. And it certainly changes the interest rate risk banks are exposed to depending on what the current level of their beta is. This time series variation is really important to accurately assess bank risk, because if you just assume a flat beta, you may very well be over or underestimating the risks that the bank is exposed to. Now, it begs the question, how do we forecast future betas better? And to me, that's like a great project, and maybe someone's already solved it in the room, but how to forecast future betas so that we can actually get a better sense of how exposed banks are to this type of deposit stability. All of the present valuing of liabilities is in the future. And much of the time when we're trying to assess deposit betas, we're kind of looking at the present or the past. And so you really want to know how sensitive deposits are on a long horizon to get a sense of how it's going to impact the economic capital of the bank. With respect to deposit insurance and reciprocal deposits, insurance is heavily associated with the risk sensitivity of depositors. These reciprocal deposit programs can provide like an alternative to deposit flight for some customers. So it may be normally they'd reallocate to a too big to fail bank just so that they have that sense of security. And here it gives another choice where they can stay in their current bank and perhaps still get that security. But it changes that risk sensitivity nature of the deposit. And that's important in thinking about the role of deposits in bank value. Now, some questions this begged for me. I mean, it was very thorough, but who bears the costs of these programs? When a bank wants to offer reciprocal deposits, it comes at a fee, and that fee might come from the depositor, or it may be the bank's willing to subsidize that to some degree because they would prefer to have insured deposits, less risk-sensitive deposits on their balance sheet. And so there's a bit of there's a bit of a mystery here about who's driving this. Is it the banks driving it? Is it the depositors driving it? Of course, it's both, but to what degree is this solving a problem for the bank or it's solving a problem for the depositor, and who's bearing the ultimate cost? And lastly, depositor characteristics. As we've already discussed, depositor behavior is highly related to depositor characteristics. Some depositors are going to be more price sensitive than others. Others are going to be more risk sensitive. These patterns seem to vary by bank size. I think a key open question driven by this paper is why would that be the case? It would be great to be able to have some measure of trust or relationship or love or whatever it is in the call report so that the rest of us could actually better estimate the value of these banks using some of these methods. I believe in tailoring. We can take something else out. We'll take something else out. I'm totally fine with that. But this could be a good thing for community banks, and I want to emphasize that, okay, I've got 16 seconds and 2 slides, so we're going to do my best. The thing about community banks, and so here I've done, I've been doing some work on this. So I took the present value of deposits. I had to make a bunch of assumptions. It's a total mess. You're not going to get under the behind the scenes on this. But the present value of deposits for the banking industry relative to the book value. And so the blue dots is the present value of the industry. So it's really going to be heavily favored by the largest banks. It's the JP Morgans, the Citigroups. These are the ones who are going to drive the industry level present value of deposits. And we can see it moves around over time. That's partly because there's time varying betas. It's also because there's time varying interest rates. There's all sorts of things that are time varying, but we can see it tends to go up when rates are low and comes down when rates are high. And that's the natural sort of interest rate movement you expect from the present value of deposit. If you're hedging that with with the present value of assets, they behave similarly, so you get like this natural hedge behavior from deposits. Now, when we stress those deposits and we assume that all the uninsured deposits have a beta of 1, which is pretty standard in the literature, you get a higher present value. And that's because we've lost some of that deposit franchise value that Mustafa was referring to. And so now you're paying more, and those present value of those liabilities is higher. And that reduces the value of the bank, right? It doesn't show up in regulatory accounting or capital ratios, but it's happening behind the scenes. And the one other thing I want to emphasize here is the green dots, because I told you those were both industry lines, but what the green dots are the average. And that average is going to be dominated by community banks. And what preliminary results here have suggested to me is that the community banks are less exposed to uninsured deposits and high deposit betas, and so the present value of their deposits tends to be lower. And this doesn't show up in like TCE or anything, but it does show up in a chart like this, and it's a good reason why we should have better information and better data collection on deposits, betas, and deposit pricing and risk sensitivity, because it could mean that we're missing important difference in actual economic resiliency of institutions because we're treating all deposits the same. I think a key lesson from this whole panel is there's heterogeneity in deposits, and it's important for the health of the banking sector. And it's important for evaluating which specific banks seem strong and which specific banks seem weak. And so, that's my big takeaway here is all of these papers can help us do that. Conceptually, we've always known that deposits are critical, but we need novel measures and novel data to be able to better drill down and distinguish between different types of deposits and different types of depositors. Some types of deposits look like wholesale funding. Other types of deposits, like Mary's customers, you're not paying them anything, and it's 40% of your deposits, and they're just sitting around, and those are vastly different products, and they have vastly different implications for investment, supervision, regulation, and sort of financial stability overall. And so I just wanted to thank the authors because I thought each of these papers was really great, and also the organizers, because I thought this was a fantastic session to highlight the importance of this additional data we can collect on deposits. Thank you.